everybody can see this the way that I want you to see it. Okay, can everybody see this okay?
Yes, it looks great.
All right, thanks. Our faces are in my way over here, so let me move us over here. All right, well, I'm excited to talk to you today about strategies to effectively engage rural community pharmacies in research. For an overview of what I'll be discussing, I'll primarily be talking about my experiences recruiting pharmacists and pharmacies through rural CP, which was just in the introduction. We've been doing that for over 6 years now, so we've got a range of experiences of things that have worked and things that have not worked. So hopefully you can pass some of that info on and have it be useful for you. And I'll also be discussing effective methods for recruiting and engaging pharmacists specifically, and then patients through pharmacies. Also throw in some tips for surveys and for trials. And all of this will only take about 30 minutes because I really love an open discussion and I love learning from people in the audience about things that have worked well or not worked well for you. So this should be fairly short for a typical seminar. So let me talk by telling you more about Rural CP. As Dr. Salgado mentioned, it's the Rural Research Alliance for Community Pharmacies, but that's quite a mouthful, so we just call it Rural CP. This is a map of our current pharmacy location. So we have 175 pharmacies across 7 states. We got started recruiting pharmacies about 6 months before the pandemic started in 2019. Originally, our goal was to get 20 pharmacies in 5 states, so it's been really fun to see the network expand over the years. This is a registered practice-based research network with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, and it is the first practice-based research network for rural community pharmacies that spans multiple states. And our mission is to reduce rural health disparities by supporting high-quality implementation research with rural community pharmacies. You can learn more about us at the website there, and we have a paper published our first year and the types of pharmacies that we enrolled into the network. Something that is fun about the Rural CP team is we are associated with a college of pharmacy in each of the states in which we operate. So this is our wonderful team here. Each person you see is a liaison for their College of Pharmacy for Rural CP. And so they work with recruiting pharmacies in that particular state and helping to communicate with pharmacies in that state. So that's an interesting way with which we work. But let's move on to how we recruit pharmacies for the network and some lessons that we've learned over the years. So there's 5 key things that I want to share with you in this space, and I'll go into each one in a little bit more detail. But it's building trust. This is the absolute most key lesson learned over the years. Addressing the interests of the pharmacist, starting small, recognizing contextual factors, and reciprocity. So building trust is super key to engaging pharmacies in research, probably any pharmacy, urban or rural. And if you can, it's great to get a warm handoff when possible. And by that, I mean to get an introduction by somebody who's already familiar with the pharmacy and that the pharmacy already trusts. That's a great way to get entree into a new area and with a new organization. But you can't always get a warm handoff, and we certainly have been recruiting pharmacies into our network that have never engaged with University of North Carolina before or any network. So if you have one takeaway, if you're going to be recruiting someone and not going through a network, is to go visit in person. This is time intensive, it is resource intensive, but not a lot of people go out to visit the rural pharmacies in person, and they really, really appreciate it. They love showing off their pharmacy. They love introducing you to their staff. This is one of the last pharmacies that we visited in the top picture here. That is the total staff for that pharmacy. And so it was great to go out and meet them. They just opened a new pharmacy out in Bryson City, North Carolina, and learn about what was going on over there. And that really helps build trust. And while we're there, we ask about the current challenges that they're facing, ask them to share what the strengths are, what they're bringing to their community. We share our commitment to rural pharmacy in general, and then specifically tell them why we'd like to work with their pharmacy. So if you're out trying to recruit a pharmacy for a research study, there's probably some aspect of that pharmacy that's really appealing or important to you. And if you let them know about that, they can see how they fit in and can make a contribution to what you're working on. One of the other things we've done, in addition to in-person visits, is go to regional pharmacy meetings. So this is a picture of our table at the South Carolina Pharmacist Association meeting. That's nice because you can just set up, you get some name recognition. If you're recruiting for a study, you can have a flyer out for your study, and people can come by and engage with you around that. So those are some examples of how we build trust. The other thing we like to do is address their interest. And over the years, from doing these in-person visits and doing surveys, I could tell you that the top interest right now among the rural pharmacists in our network are financial concerns, by and far. They're really wanting ways to get adequate reimbursement for services. They're concerned about pharmacy benefit managers. They're expressing issues with predatory health insurance in their communities where people will come in trying to sell these lower premium plans. That means they lose access to their local pharmacy. So lots of things going on, definitely top of mind. If you're doing anything around reimbursement or financial threats, that's going to be really well received with rural pharmacies right now, because it's definitely at the top of mind. The second most common thing that we hear when we go out is diabetes. So diabetes is an issue in every single community that we've gone into, and pharmacists are looking for ways to expand services for diabetes management. We also hear about hypertension, issues with medication adherence. How can they assist with medication adherence, health literacy issues in their populations? So these things come up pretty commonly. What you see on the right there is an example of how we've engaged pharmacists in their interests. So, with the network, we were initially focusing on COVID-19 and vaccination issues very heavily since we got started in 2019. And, everything was COVID at pharmacies for a while. But once we were able to move past that and we were doing these in-person site visits again and hearing about financial issues, we did a financial threat survey with pharmacists. So we said, we hear you, we hear this is what, this is the major issue. Tell us more. Tell us more about what's going on. And so we published that, and then it ended up getting press in multiple avenues. And this is with NPR. So the woman in the middle is a rural pharmacist in our network in North Carolina. And we got to sit down and do a joint interview together with NPR talking about financial threats. And so that's an example of how we listened to them and then set our research agenda based on what they were telling us was important. When you're trying to engage a pharmacy in research, don't start off by emphasizing your research interests. Top-down ivory tower approach is not really appreciated when you're going into these communities where you're coming in and saying, hey, we're doing this and here's what we need. Or we've noticed this problem in your community and we think that you'd be, great for addressing this problem. Like, let them tell you what their problems are and then find areas for alignment. I think that's a much better approach. And it also helps build trust and trust in what you're doing. Another thing that I'd recommend is not jumping into a randomized trial with a pharmacy straight away if you haven't worked together before. Start small if you can. We usually start with surveys or interview studies. This is a nice way to build a history of working with the pharmacy, finding out what works with communication or doesn't work. Other things you can do is invite pharmacists to be on an advisory board for a study. That's a way to get to know them better, establish some rapport. We co-developed interventions with pharmacists. So this is a screenshot from one of our counseling trainings that we did around vaccine hesitancy that was co-developed with rural pharmacists. And that was a nice way to really get to know, pharmacists in a non stressful kind of trial situation. So if you can start small, I would recommend that. It's a way to find ways that you work effectively together as partners in research. Also, from the front end, you really want to think about these contextual factors as you're developing your study and your study protocol. There's a lot of barriers to participation in general for pharmacy research, and then also specifically for rural pharmacies. Um, Pharmacists have a lack of protected time to work on these types of studies. They might have low interest in your research topic. Like I said, finding areas of alignment is important. And I'm not saying you can't go in with something that may not be, at the top of their priority list, but if you start by listening to them first about like, is this important? And you'd be like, oh, here's something that we've gotten some funding for. Would this be of interest to you at all? Or can you see this being important in your pharmacy environment? So trying to build that interest ahead of time is important. Also, most pharmacists aren't trained in research. Maybe they did, an evidence-based practice course or something like that, but they don't have a lot of confidence in the research process. So developing your protocols and submission of material so it makes sense to them and they understand how to do it is important. And then also they have competing priorities. So they're filling prescriptions, they're offering services, they're putting schedules together. So making sure that what you develop can fit in with that. And also allow them to maintain their pharmacy efficiency. So you don't want to have a highly intensive intervention or study that's taking a lot of time. Something that we've run into over the years is staff turnover being a major issue in rural areas. And I'd say, probably about 40% of our pharmacies really have issues even recruiting technicians to work in the pharmacy that stay for more than several months at a time. So staffing can be an issue. So if you're wanting to engage technicians in research, I think that's something to really be aware of in the rural environment. But to the extent that you can design your study to accommodate these factors and be able to be flexible with these factors ahead of time, it will probably have more success. Then there's reciprocity. So don't just get your data and leave. I think this leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. It feels extractive to people. One of the best things you can do is share your research results afterwards. So if people took the time to fill out your survey or participate in a trial or do an interview, they're probably interested in the topic and they'd like to know what you find. So even putting together a one pager that you share with folks after the study is really appreciated. Also, building in adequate financial incentives, like showing them that you really value their time and you understand how valuable their time is by giving them a decent incentive to participate is well appreciated. Something that we've done is nominated people who have, once the study's over, if they participated with us or worked on things with us, and nominate them for awards with the State Pharmacy Association or National Pharmacy Associations. We actually nominated one of our pharmacists for an immunization champion award with APHA, and she won the other year. So that was really cool. And it shows that, hey, we really value you and we think you're doing awesome work. And they appreciate that. Also, offer to be a resource. So, like I said, don't just leave after your study's done, but say, hey, if you ever have any questions around this topic, feel free to reach out to us. And we've had pharmacies in the network reaching out, like they're experiencing a new problem. And, if we don't know because it's not our area, because we're at a college of pharmacy, we can refer them to someone else, or we can refer them to someone at the State Pharmacy Association that might be able to answer their questions. So, being a continued resource is important and it builds trust. The picture that I have over here is we actually offer CE credit and like CE programming for our rural CP pharmacists. And so that's another example of how we give back. So let's move on to recruiting pharmacists. So we talked a little bit about recruiting pharmacies and some of the things we could do there. But what about recruiting pharmacists? So if possible, begin again because of the trust issues, but recruiting through established practice-based research networks, and I think there's currently 7 pharmacy practice-based research networks, or other networks. Maybe you've got alumni networks at your school, or just somewhere else where there's an interface and mechanism for communicating with folks. That's a great way to go. Rather than starting from scratch. Or, in North Carolina, we can get an email list of all the practicing pharmacies and pharmacists in the state and send it out. But that again, going through a network has been much more effective for recruitment. If you are going to do something like email recruitment, let's say you've got a list of pharmacies that you want to recruit, if you have the resources, I highly recommend not solely relying on email recruitment. I can't tell you how many times our emails have ended up in junk mail folders, or we found out pharmacists don't check their store email, but maybe once a month, or just all kinds of things going on. So if you can and you have time and resources, building in phone follow-up after you send an initial email is great. And you can just call under the context that you're checking to see if they got your email. And it's kind of surprising the number of times people haven't seen your email. And so that engages them in the process and they can be on the lookout for it after that. Um, We've had some luck doing mail follow-up. So getting stuff in the mail didn't used to be novel, but with the advent of email, it is now. And so putting stuff through the mail can kind of rise above the noise, like especially you have a nice cover letter, a nice description of what you're doing. You put a QR code in there that links them to more information about your study. But that's a good way to get people's attention if you're not able to get a hold of them via email or the phone. And then this is new, gift baskets. So the last study that recruited through our network, they actually sent gift baskets to folks. And I'm going to show you a slide, the next slide, showing how that impacted recruitment. But they just put in goodies, like local goodies from the area. They were out of Chapel Hill, so they put in Chapel Hill toffee and stuff like that and sent it out. And that really gets above the noise because it's not very often you get gift baskets in the mail. So that's a great way to get people's attention and bring attention to your study. Some additional tips for email communication. So if you're recruiting via email, make sure you use their name. And if you're not familiar with the Dillman book, like the Dillman method for survey recruitment, there's a lot of detail in there about how you can go through and personalize communications to increase response rate. So I'd recommend looking at that. Something else that we've done, if we realize we're not getting the regional representation that we want in a survey, we'll block pharmacists together into a specific region and say, hey, pharmacists from Southeastern North Carolina aren't really represented well in our current results, and we want to make sure that your voice and your opinions are represented. Would you consider taking the time to fill out the survey? And that has boosted our response rate. So that's another kind of personalization that you can do to an email to get more interest. Other things that we've done that have boosted response rates is if we're just 5 pharmacists short, like sending out emails saying like, hey, we only need 5 more people. Can you help us? It's kind of like a fundraising goal almost, right? Like, can you help us reach our goal? We're so close and we really appreciate it. So sometimes that can boost the response rate as well. So this is looking at that multi-method, multimodal recruitment that was done in the last study that used the gift baskets. So at the time, I think we had like around 170 pharmacists in the network. So when they sent out the initial email, which if you look at the timing, it was sent out during the holiday season in December, they only got 20 people to respond initially. But then they sent the second reminder email out, towards the end of January, and they got a boost of 20 participants. Then you kind of see the slough off, which you definitely see with email recruitment. The more reminders you send out, you don't get as much of a boost. They got 10 more. But then they did the follow-up with the phone calls to see if they got the emails. And they also sent out gift baskets and followed up to see if they got the gift baskets. And as you can see, they had a huge boost in recruitment there. And then they eventually ended up reaching their recruitment target. So that's just an example of how that worked in this one particular study. Now talking about recruiting patients through pharmacies. So there's a couple of ways to go about it. It's going to depend on how your IRB works. So unfortunately, in North Carolina, or at least at UNC, if you're going to have a pharmacist actively talk to someone about your study and give them information about your study, like in an active way, they are considered part of the study team and they have to complete city training. Sit down and do the 3 to 4 hours of city training, and they have to be listed as study personnel. Now, this might not be the same at different universities, so if you're thinking about doing this, definitely check in ahead of time to see how your university is going to operate around this. But if it does require human ethics training, it's nice because it's an active recruitment to have the pharmacist look through the records, find out who's potentially eligible, do a direct approach to patients, tell them about the study, get the contact information of folks that are interested and share it with the study team. That's a very nice way to do it if you can. If you are going to go that route and you're able to go that route, just make sure you're paying the pharmacy well to reimburse them for their time, because that is a pretty heavy lift for the pharmacist to go through and do that work. Now, if you can't do that, if you're like, wow, it's just not going to be feasible to ask these busy pharmacists to complete city training so they can be listed on our IRB application, there's some other ways to go. So you can send study staff to the pharmacy to recruit patients. The benefit of that is it maintains that more active recruitment, which tends to be more effective. But I would put a big caution on that in a rural community. If you're sending somebody that's not part of that community in to sit in the pharmacy and talk about research studies, that's probably going to be viewed with distrust. And like, who is this person and what are they doing in here? So, it tends to not be trusted by community. I don't know many people that have gone this route. But if you feel like active recruitment is the way to go, you could talk to the pharmacist at that particular pharmacy and see how well they think something like this would be received. But the thing that we tend to do, where they don't have to do city training to help with recruitment, is just asking them to display flyers. So flyers that have information about your study. I'll show you a couple of examples. They post it in the pharmacy in prominent places. They put it in prescription bags. And then this passive method of recruitment, I mean, usually passive methods are not as effective, but it does get eyes of patients on a lot of your flyers, and you can get interest that way. Do offer to print and mail those materials to the pharmacist. You want to make this as few barriers as possible for them to do this. So see if they like that. Sometimes they want to print it on their own printer at their pharmacy, which is totally fine. And then make sure you follow up to see if they need more. You can mail it to them if they do, and that also gives you an idea if they're actually distributing the flyers. So here's a result from one study. So this is one of my sad pandemic studies that took place during the pandemic. We were recruiting patients who would be at high risk of opioid overdose from 4 different states. And we used various patient recruitment strategies in those different states. You can see in that top line with pharmacy referrals, that's where we got the bulk of our patients. So by far, this was the most effective method for recruiting patients with specific pharmacy experiences. The example of our recruitment flyer is over there on the right. It was nice. We got to work with our Clinical and Translational Science Institute at UNC. They helped us develop the flyer. We had some rural patients and caregivers look at it before we sent it out. And they would just, again, it was passive recruitment, so they would just respond to us if they were interested. The nice thing about this is that pharmacies received a $25 incentive for each eligible patient who actually completed an interview. And so I think that was motivating for the pharmacist. And we were like, hey, we've got $50 more for you this month. You had 2 more patients from your pharmacy. Thank you so much. They encourage them to keep recruiting. And if you want to read more about that, we have a paper with more detail that you can refer to. This is the gift basket study. So the one that I was referring to earlier. So when they sent out gift baskets to individuals, they also emailed 50 flyers to the pharmacies, and they made sure that folks got those flyers. And you can see a picture of what their recruitment flyer looked like over there. The flyer included multiple methods where patients could contact the study team members. That's a Google Voice number there, so that seemed to work well for that study team. And they just asked the it was the passive recruitment. They just asked the pharmacist to put the flyers up and put it in prescription bags of potentially eligible individuals. And this ended up working really well, actually. I was kind of surprised, but because patients were getting paid $50, I think that nice incentive might have led to more interest than I usually see through passive recruitment strategies. So they ended up with 73 interested patients. I think they were only trying to get about 22 to 24, so they went way over their recruitment target. And there's a paper, hopefully, that will be coming out that'll tell you more about specifically how they recruited pharmacists and patients. So it's a recruitment focused paper, so it's pretty cool. Getting into tips for surveys, we're all looking to increase survey response rates when we're doing survey research. As I talked about earlier, that multimodal personalized follow-up where you're doing emails followed by phone calls is a really great way to do it. Sometimes if you have the cell phone numbers of individuals, you can text them as well. Text works really well with pharmacy owners, I found out over the years. Just text them like, hey, did you get this? And they'll say, oh, no, I didn't get it. Text it to me. And so that's a great way to increase participation. Something that I see pretty commonly is that people haven't really curated their recipient list a priori, meaning they got this big list of, pharmacists and they're like, okay, I'm going to email everybody, but they didn't go through and do work on the front end because they could potentially eliminate some folks who they know aren't going to be eligible. Like if you're focused on community pharmacy and your list includes hospital pharmacists, those are folks that you can get out of your denominator of your response rate. So I would encourage you to sit with your recipient list a little bit before you start contacting everyone. Because if they never respond, you won't know if they were ineligible or not. Okay, this is the big reveal. If you remember one thing out of survey research, I think we found the price point or like the ideal reimbursement rate for pharmacists for a survey. $75 for a 20 to 25 minute survey gets us usually at least a 50% response rate on our surveys. So that's really nice. I think there's a lot of $50 surveys out there, so having $75 gives it that extra boost and feels like worthwhile for their time to like take time out of their day or work on this on their day off. So yeah, $75 it works well. And we found that online gift cards work well. They're really easy to track to make sure people have gotten their gift card, or if they have any issues, it's usually easy to resolve online. Another big takeaway is before you send out your recruitment materials, your recruitment email or your letter or however you're doing it, have practicing rural pharmacists review it ahead of time. So they've helped us update our subject lines. They've helped us put things into bullet points, told us what to put into bold. So these are the things that are important to pharmacists, and this is what would get their attention. So I highly recommend doing that if you can. Also, lesson learned, again, after 6 years of recruiting pharmacists for studies, don't send emails on Mondays. Like, pharmacies are really busy on Monday. They're getting set up for the week, getting deliveries, getting things sorted out. So don't send anything on Monday. Just cross that day off your list as a potential day to send things out. But do this. If you send your first email, let's say on a Tuesday morning, when you send a reminder email out, send it on Thursday afternoon. Mix up the dates and times because you're going to be more likely to catch people during their email time if you have alternative times that you're sending things. Other big thing, and I know this doesn't always work with study timelines, but again, if it's something that you can account for on the front end, don't try to recruit pharmacists during vaccination season. This is just a really bad idea. They're super, super busy. They don't have a lot of free time. And so studies really aren't going to be a priority during that time. So I'd say mid-August through end of November, if you can avoid trying to recruit pharmacists during that time, that's great. Also, and you probably know why, first 2 weeks of January are no. And that's because everybody's coming into the pharmacy with their new insurance. and they're working out a ton of insurance issues at the beginning of the year. So that's also not a good time to try to be recruiting pharmacists for surveys or interviews. Okay, moving on to tips for trials. Um, I had a trial in our network fail just stupendously. Just about anything that could go wrong with this trial probably went wrong with this trial. So, gonna share some lessons learned from that with you. The big takeaway from the table that's on here, we had 15 pharmacies that were actually enrolled and supposed to submit data over 6 months. Look at the number of zeros on there. That zero, every zero you see is they didn't send us any of our primary outcome data that month. So a lot of zeros there. And if you add it up across with those 20% and 40%, we only had 43% of the pharmacies adopt the intervention and send data in about it. So it was really bad. And even before we got started, we had enrolled 19. But then as we were getting ready to actually start the trial and start data collection, we lost 4 right away. One had been sold, one pharmacy had closed, 2 had major staff turnover issues, and like, oh, we just can't participate right now. So that happened right out of the gate. And if you looked over that total 6-month period, we only had 3 pharmacies that had submitted 100% of their primary outcome data. So it's like, whew, what do we do? It's an NIH funded trial. Like, we really failed this year. What should we do? And the thing that was super helpful is we called together a panel, like an advisory board of implementation science experts. We presented the data. We talked about, the conversations we had with pharmacists about what were going on, and they helped us devise a plan to turn this around. And once we had specific things that we were going to do to address each of the issues, we presented it to our program officer, and they said, yeah, go ahead, move forward with this adaptive trial, and we'll see what happens. And amazingly, what we call now the first year of our trial, since this year ended up being a pilot year, we got 100% of our primary outcome data, and we got 93% of our secondary outcome data. So they really helped us turn it around. And I'll give you some of the specific things. There's a paper, I think I put the citation on the previous slide if you want to read in more detail, but here's some of the things that we changed to make it more effective. During recruitment phase, we had a call with the different folks that were potentially interested, and we were very clear about things like study duration, what the weekly time expectations, who's involved, how do you submit data, and we made sure that all of those aspects were going to be feasible for participants. Like, is your main pharmacist going out on maternity leave in the next 6 months? If so, then this is probably not the ideal time to be participating in the study. And so when you sit down and go through at that level of detail, you can identify potential hiccups that would happen if the pharmacy would enroll. The other thing we did was discuss why the data are important. And something that really resonated with our rural pharmacists, this was NIH funded, as we said that, this is taxpayer dollars at work. So we have a research question, that folks think are important, and we're using taxpayer dollars to answer it. And so if we don't get enough data, we won't be able to answer that question, and it's kind of like wasted money. And that really seemed to resonate. And they're like, oh yeah, we definitely want to make sure, we want to help you get your data. We were also very upfront with them that we were going to gently harass them if they enroll in the study and they don't submit data, we're going to gently harass you until the data come in. And they chuckled at it. Like, I was afraid we might, offend them. Like, we're going to keep calling or texting you, but no, they're like, oh no, you feel free to bug me as much as you want. I know I get busy. Do whatever you need to do, and I'll make sure I got it in. So that was actually really well received. Then, when we were actually enrolling the pharmacy, some changes that we made is had a very thorough onboarding call where we had a flow chart that said exactly what was happening when. They could check things off as they were doing it to make sure that they were moving along. this is really key, getting a backup method of contact. So you're not always going to be able to get through at the pharmacy, phone to the person that you're trying to get through. So get the cell phone number if you can, and then assess what they think is the best way to contact them. Should we text you? Should we email you? Like, what days and times are best to reach you? Just get all that information ahead of time. Um, Also, identify a champion for the study. There's probably somebody who's pretty excited about the study if they've enrolled, and make that your point person for interactions. Also, I've noticed, you can get a pharmacy owner that's super excited about your study and say like, oh, I want this location and this location and this location to be involved. And in that case, those locations can feel like they're being voluntold to participate in the study. And so we found sitting down with staff that are at those types of locations and saying, hey, we know you didn't directly sign up for this for yourself. Is there anything that we could do to make this easier for you? Is there anything we do to make this study more accommodating, to better fit your schedule? Just to show that you're aware of that and you're willing to work with them has seemed to work well. And then providing multiple options for submitting data. So if your IRB allows it and you don't have super sensitive data coming through, they can fax data. They can text data. So for our study, it wasn't super sensitive. There was no identifiable information. So our IRB approved that the pharmacist could take pictures of their conversation cards and text it to us because there was no identifying information. And so they were able to text pictures and we were able to get our data. That was helpful. And then asking them to do a test run of submitting data is really great. So like, okay, you've said that you want to fax, your conversation cards to us. Can you try sending it to this number today so we could, just fill something out fake, send it to us and we'll make sure it works. Super helpful. And then during the study, just make sure you're assessing data submission and completeness, especially early on in the study, fairly frequently, so you can see if there's any issues and you can nip those issues in the bud if you're having things not show up. Also, like I said, assess the good days to connect with the pharmacist and make sure that you have staff available to connect with the pharmacist on those days. We would pre-populate calendars for the study team with their availability to do different activities. And then when we were in contact with the pharmacist, we would sign folks up during those times using a pre-populated list. And specifically, to give you an example, because that's kind of vague, we had standardized patient interactions that the pharmacist had to complete every month. And so when they'd finish with that first standardized patient interaction, that standardized patient would go to the shared calendar and be like, okay, we need to schedule you for March. When are you available in March? And they would tell them like, okay, I'm going to sign you up for March 5th at 2 p.m. And then they'd notify that standardized patient like, okay, Bob's meeting with you. Make sure you call him and send a reminder. So super helpful ways like getting that next data collection time scheduled while you're in person and having a real-time interaction was super helpful. All right, so we're coming to the end. So key takeaways are build trust before recruiting and maintain trust by continuing to engage with the folks who were nice enough to share their data with you. Use established networks when that's possible. Use multiple methods to recruit and follow up. Be adaptable. There's always going to be things that come up in a study. It's never going to go exactly the way that you want it to, but be able to pivot and be flexible. Pay decent incentives. Make sure you're doing that for patients and pharmacists. And also, when you're first designing your study, remember, your study is never going to be at the top of any rural pharmacist priority list. So how can you design your study to make it easy for them to participate? How can you break down any barriers on the front end so it's just easy for them to pop in, submit data, do surveys, do interviews? So that's all for that. I know this will get posted online. So if people have questions and they want to connect with me, this is my contact information. Also, I put rural CP up here. Our follower statistics on these various sites are a little sad. So if you want to give us a little boost, feel free to follow us. We send out information about our studies and what we're doing. So it's a good way to stay updated about